Hello, welcome to the lecture on abortion. Today we're going to be talking about A Defense of Abortion by Judith Jarvis Thomson. Thomson was born in 1929. She's still teaching at MIT, used to be the president of the APA, the American Philosophical Association, and is one of the premier writers on women's rights and a defense of abortion. So when we begin looking at abortion, it's important to note that traditionally arguments around abortion have centered on whether or not the fetus is an actual human being or not. It's often difficult to mark out what it means to be a human being. Is being a human being having a heartbeat? Is it being able to sustain life outside of the womb? Does it happen at conception with the creation of individual DNA that's separate from the mother? And so um, these arguments that centered on whether or not the fetus is a human being have suggested there's no good reason really for drawing the line until birth, right? Because if we don't know whether the fetus is a human being, if we say that the fetus is a fetus until it's born and then becomes a human being, then we can see the line of reasoning where we can abort the fetus because we're not actually aborting a human being. This, of course, changes if we define the fetus in a different way. And we can see a typical analogy of this if I were to take a pine nut or a pine seed and plant it in the ground. Is that pine seed a pine tree? Does it have the potential to be a pine tree? If I plant the seed in the ground and then the next day take it out of the ground, have I killed a pine tree, or have I just taken away that potential? And does that mean the same thing? Now, to make matters less confusing, Thompson actually grants her opponents the premise that fetuses are human beings right from birth. So she suggests even if we think of fetuses as human beings, it still isn't clear how advocates of pro-life get from the premise to the conclusion that abortion is morally impermissible. So she's ultimately going to argue that even if we consider a fetus a human being, we should still be able to make a case for abortions. And so she suggests this following reason, right? Every person has a right to life. So the fetus, right, a person has the right to life as well. No doubt the mother also has a right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life, right, the fetus, the human being being born, uh, their right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed and abortion may not be performed. Again, this is going to be the typical argument against what Thompson is advocating here. And she is going to say that even though we tend to believe that the right to life is stronger than the right to decide what happens in and to a woman's body, uh, we should still be able to create a sense, or we should still be able to have abortions. And in fact, isn't necessarily going to be um, a kind of battle between this right to life and right to decide what happens. And so Thompson presents a very interesting thought experiment case called the violinist case. Now, say someone is kidnapped and hooked up to a famous dying violinist. The violinist will die if unhooked from this person. This violinist is a person with a right to life. So, is it morally permissible to unhook yourself from the violinist? So here we're given this kind of thought experiment of being kidnapped and hooked up to someone famous who's dying, so that let's say they're hooked up to you, hooked up to your kidneys, so you're kind of filtering out their blood, you're keeping them alive. Um, Thompson wants to argue or wants to ask, is it morally permissible for you to unhook this famous person from you, ultimately killing the famous person, right? Or is this impermissible? Is it required? Is it morally required for you to stay hooked up to the person? Because, as we noted in the last slide, we tend to think that life outweighs the choice of what should happen to one's body. So, is the famous person's life worth more than my decision to have my body being used to support this person? Or is supporting this person not really within my position to take, and therefore I can simply just unplug the famous person from myself and having that person die? And so we can see the correlation here between this thought experiment and pregnancy. Now, it's been thought, though, that this may only be supported in cases of rape. And so, again, one thing that you might notice from this violinist case, right, is someone is kidnapped and hooked up to the famous dying violinist, right? And by being kidnapped, we are being forced against our will to be connected, to be hooked up to this person. And so we might say in this case that because I had no choice in the matter, the person's life who I'm hooked up with does not outweigh my decision of what happens to my body. And this changes when we consciously engage in sex, when we understand and accept the responsibility that what could happen from this is a pregnancy. So if you were to be doing an action where the possibility existed for you to be hooked up to a famous dying violinist, does that change what weighs more, the life or your decision to choose what happens in into your own body? And Thompson thinks no, it doesn't. It doesn't just express cases of rape. It really comes down to our challenging the right to life and the challenge of the right to life defense that we're talking about here. So when we look at just something like the extreme view when it comes to abortion, on the extreme view side, uh, pro-life advocates believe abortion is impermissible no matter what. So even if the mother's life is at risk, it is still morally impermissible for an abortion to take place. And this is supported by the argument from direct killing, right? So it's not directly, or it's not permissible to directly kill someone, and therefore by directly aborting the fetus, we are directly killing someone, and this type of action is never permissible. Now, this is the extreme view, but Thompson wants to suggest that no, there is a right to self-defense, and that there can be cases in which it is permissible to directly kill another. And this should strike us as being reasonable from the outset when we think about cases of self-defense, for instance. If someone is about to kill me or my loved one, at least in this country, it is legally permissible. Now, we don't want to confuse moral and legal, but it is legally permissible, and many would argue also morally permissible for you to take matters into your own hands, defend yourself, even if that meant killing the individual that was attempting to kill you. Now, when we talk about the argument against abortion doesn't take away the right to decide what happens to one's body, there are different conceptions when we're looking at the right to life defense. So, in one instance, we're being given the bare minimum needs for continued life. In the other, having the right not to be killed by anyone. So, when we look at the violinist case, right, the violinist is being given minimum needs for continued life. And this is necessarily not the same as having the right not to be killed by anyone. We believe that everyone has the right not to be killed, but that we should also kind of be given the bare minimum one needs for continued life. So, for instance, it is impermissible for a mother to have a child and then to just leave that child in a dumpster without the needs for continued life. And so, when we are looking at these two conceptions, they're going to be very important when it comes down to how Thompson is arguing her position and what it means for someone to have the right not to be killed versus having the bare minimum to live. And my having the bare minimums taken away from me are not the same as being killed. So, for instance, if I had the violinist hooked up to me and then I were to shoot the violinist dead, I would be taking away their right to be killed. In the first instance, though, if I were to simply unplug them from me, I would only be taking away the minimum needs for their continued life. And this is different, Thompson believes, because it is not necessarily our responsibility to keep that person alive, to provide those minimum needs for continued life in certain situations. And one in which she gives is the right to self-defense. So a problem occurs in that the right to life doesn't necessarily guarantee one the right to anything required to meet it. So again, I don't need to necessarily kill the violinist, I just need to unplug them. And then they will die of natural causes on their own, something that I am not necessarily responsible for. She also provides the example of the Henry Fonda example and being able to save someone's life simply by being touched by the cool hand of Henry Fonda. And so, does this mean that you then deserve the touch of Henry Fonda? Or does it just mean that if Henry Fonda gave you the touch, you'd be doing the same, or you'd be doing the same kindness, not the same kindness, but doing a kindness that is unnecessary but appreciated? Or would you actually deserve it? And Thompson is going to argue that you do not deserve the cool touch of Henry Fonda. You only can appreciate and receive it out of the kindness of Henry Fonda. And therefore, it is not Henry Fonda's required moral duty to save lives. So when it comes to abortion, we want to suggest, or Thompson wants to suggest rather, that the right of life consists not necessarily in the right not to be killed, but rather the right not to be killed unjustly. And so, if a woman voluntarily engages in intercourse knowing the chances of becoming pregnant, is aborting a fetus so conceived violating its right to life? Again, Thompson's going to say no. So in certain instances, there are going to be examples when the mother's life is put at risk and the killing or the removing the fetus is in essence a way of saving the mother's life. And so the mother is able to have the right to her life not being killed. Just like if someone were to break into your house, threaten to shoot you, and you were to kill that person in self defense, how you would have that right to do that. Similarly, a woman whose life is being threatened by the fetus would have the right to abortion. Now, that being the case, it's not necessarily just in cases where the right to the mother's life is threatened physically. There are also instances where the mother's life is threatened in other ways, and Thompson's going to want to say that there is still a right for the abortion, or that abortions are permissible, assuming, let's say, financial obligations and responsibilities, psychological responsibilities, or psychological needs and mental health awareness kind of issues come into play. So it's not necessarily just if the baby is going to kill the mother, but essentially if the life of the mother is going to be such that both the baby and the mother are now going to be in harm's way, either mentally, physically, financially, emotionally, and so forth. Now, this being the case, Thompson even admits that there's some lines of reasoning that would suggest that in some cases, abortion is not right. So if a woman was pregnant and she wanted to, the pregnancy was going to interfere with her travel plans to travel around the world, this would be just a mere inconvenience rather than something that is life altering or threatening. And therefore, we wouldn't say that abortion in this instance is permissible. So she's going out on a limb and saying that there are some cases in which abortions are wrong. However, the argument is essentially that the right to life is not as important as the right to choose for the woman in cases where there are going to be difficulties, problems, whether it be physical, mental, emotional, financial, and so forth. And so, one example she gives to support her position is the burglar and person plant examples. So, in this instance, let's say a burglar breaks into your apartment and then demands to stay. Now, is their staying a right of theirs over and above the right for you to throw that person out? Or better yet, think of the person plant example that Thompson uses. This idea that we have windows in our apartment. We open up the window and we have a screen, and that screen prevents these particular dust mites that Thompson talks about from blowing into our house. Because if one of these dust mites were to blow into our house and fall on the couch or the carpet, it would sprout up a person plant, if you will. And so in this instance, we should be able, even though we have screens on our windows that prevent these person plant seeds from taking root in our house and are effective 99% of the time, right? Think of the analogy between a condom and this screen. Even if one were to get by, we should still be able to remove the plant, the person plant, from our home because it is an unwanted intruder. It is something that is not wanted. And for Thompson, this idea outweighs the fact that we could just always keep the door or the window closed. So some might argue, well, why don't we just, if there's even a 1% chance that a person plant seed will blow in through the window, why not always keep the window closed, right? Think of abstinence. That way, we know that there's not, that we're 100% sure that there's not going to be a person plant that sprouts up in the upholstery or the carpet. But again, Thompson argues that this isn't a reasonable position to forego ever opening a window. This type of behavior can lead to lots of problems, whether it be um, socioeconomic problems, whether it be racial problems that can come from this, the idea that we are not allowing certain behaviors or certain groups of people based on their culture, their race, their socioeconomic status, being unable to engage in something natural like opening up a window in the example, or having sex analogously. And this is not okay. And so Thompson is going to, again, argue that we have the right, because we do not want this intruder in, that we may remove the intruder, just like we would unplug the violinist. Now, it's important to understand that Thompson notes some people consider it the case that anytime there is an ought, there is a corresponding right. And this she disagrees with. And this kind of takes us back to the Henry Fonda example. But think now for the case of unplugging the violinist in a situation where I'm plugged into the violinist, and rather than needing to be plugged into me for 9 months, the violinist only needs to be plugged into me for 1 hour. Now, if the violinist only needed to be plugged in for 1 hour, or let's say, in order to cure your ailment, Henry Fonda needed to touch your head, and Henry Fonda was in the next room, right? Now, in this case, does the ought imply a right? So let's say I'm kidnapped, I'm connected to the violinist. They tell me you only need to be connected for 1 hour. I think to myself, that sucks, that's annoying. 1 hour, fine, whatever. If it takes me 1 hour to save a human's life, all right, right. I ought, as a decent human being, I ought to do this, right? But does this make it necessarily a right? Am I forced to do this? Absolutely not, right? So again, even if Henry Fonda was in the next room, and all it took to cure you was Henry Fonda coming in and touching your head, then Henry Fonda ought to do that, right? Because it would be so easy. But does this mean there is a necessity for that to happen? Should I be forced to last to the 1 hour? And no. Thompson argues absolutely not. While we may do it just because it's the right thing to do, or rather, should we do it even though it's just kind of a good thing to do? Is there a right and wrong associated with that? No, there's not. Right? I am not wrong, or I am not morally obliged to be plugged into the violinist for 1 hour. Just like Henry Fonda, even though if in the next room, is not obliged to come in and touch your head and cure your ailment. And so Thompson is making this argument that just because we sometimes ought to do things doesn't mean we necessarily, or there's necessarily a right to do those things. And so again, just look back at the example where Henry Fonda has to come into the room. Would it be good of Henry Fonda to do that? Yeah. Would we, on some level, expect Henry Fonda to just, yeah, come in the room, touch the head? Yeah. Would we, though, punish Henry Fonda if Henry Fonda decided not to do that? And Thompson is going to say, no, we shouldn't punish. Because Henry Fonda has the right to the decisions that Henry Fonda does. Just like I have the decision, right? I can stay plugged into the violinist for an hour, right? I would be doing a good thing. But should I be punished for not doing that? No, of course not. And so this is where Thompson really distinguishes from just simply being a good Samaritan, doing the minimally decent Good Samaritan deed, just meeting very basic expectations, versus again, this obligation to do something or be punished morally, criminally for it. Like we wouldn't expect that for 9 months, so why just because we lessen the time should we expect it for 1 hour?